Salvete, and welcome back to Weekly Roman History. I'm your host, Madeline Weiner. In our last video, Rome teetered on the brink of destruction for about 50 years in the crisis of the 3rd century, before regaining stability under the reformer Diocletian. This week, we will finish out Diocletian's reign and go through Constantine, who will alter the foundations of the Roman Empire forever. But first, a few questions for review. First, what happened to Emperor Valerian? Pause now if you need to think about it. If you said he was murdered by his troops, good guess, because that happened to a lot of emperors in the 3rd century crisis. But incorrect. Valerian was captured alive by the Sasanian Persian prince Shapur and kept as a slave for the rest of his life. His son Gallienus took over for him. Next, what two regions broke away from the empire during the reign of Gallienus, only to be restored by Aurelian? The two regions were Gaul, Spain, and Britain, also known as the Gallic Empire, and the East, which was ruled briefly by Zenobia. Aurelian, the restitutor orbis, brought them back into the fold. Finally, how many emperors form a tetrarchy? If you said 4, you're right. 2 Augusti, or senior emperors, and 2 Caesars, junior emperors who will become Augusti next. 1 Augustus and Caesar for the West, and 1 Augustus and Caesar for the East. The first tetrarchy is Diocletian and Maximian as Augusti, and Galerius and Constantius as Caesars. Diocletian and Galerius collaborate to rule the East, and Maximian and Constantius rule the West. Diocletian brings so much change to the empire that historians have a new name to the governmental system he leaves behind. Augustus began the Principate, a polite cooperation between the emperor and the Senate that preserved the illusion of a republic. Diocletian begins the Dominate, an explicitly authoritarian system, with the emperor in full command. The trend for the entire empire period has been less local control and more centralized bureaucracy, and Diocletian brings this trend to its logical conclusion, almost total centralization. He completely reforms the way the provinces are run. He divides the 50 or so provinces into about 100 and puts civilian governors called praesides in charge of them. He puts different leaders in charge of the military. They're called duces, leaders, and comites, companions. They eventually evolve into dukes and counts in the medieval era. The military borders do not coincide with the provincial ones. Diocletian fully divorces civil and military power in the provinces for the first time in Rome's history. This is designed to discourage usurpers. No one man has absolute power in any given region, except the tetrarchs. And because Diocletian never met a problem he couldn't split, he also splits the traditional legions of 5,000 soldiers into units of 1,000, which are easier to mobilize to deal with multiple crises at a time. Like Aurelian before him, Diocletian's attempts to control the economy don't work as well as his military endeavors. He wipes away centuries of change and reestablishes a silver currency almost identical to that of the Julio-Claudians, but inflation continues. So he tries to simply boss the economy around. He puts out the Edict of Maximum Prices, ordering that no one charge more than a prescribed amount for various goods. This is completely unenforceable and is largely ignored, so it's eventually repealed. One thing Diocletian does succeed in is reforming taxes. He creates a much more complex system of taxation that is fairer to the people and makes government income more stable and predictable. But it involves registering tenant farmers to their land, so as an unintended consequence, it makes it much more difficult for people to pull up stakes and move. Diocletian unintentionally lays the groundwork for what will become the medieval serf system. On the religious front, things have been quiet since about 260. Religious minorities, especially the Christians, have not been troubled by the government. An entire generation has grown up in this era of calm tolerance. But Diocletian is a religious traditionalist. Where many recent emperors had encouraged worship of the sun, Diocletian is all about the traditional gods. Recall him depicting him and Maximian as Jupiter and Hercules. In the early 300s, Diocletian launches initiatives against religious minorities. For this next part, you need to understand the position of ancient state religion. The worship of the traditional gods, Jupiter and Ceres and such, is part of the workings of government. Official sacrifices keep the gods on Rome's side. Modern religions, Christianity among them, concern themselves with what individual followers believe in their hearts. But Roman state religion has a transactional relationship with the gods. People do the sacrifices and the state gets the rewards, regardless of what the people actually believe in. So religious diversity doesn't threaten traditional religion as long as everyone is still willing to make sacrifices and take part in ceremonies. Most ancient religions were polytheistic, so conquered people with all kinds of beliefs could hang on to their own gods while still sacrificing to Roman ones. Judaism presented a problem because they were monotheists and refused to make Roman sacrifices. But they were a tiny minority and didn't usually try to convert people, so Roman governors tended to consider them a harmless exception. The growth of Christianity throughout the empire is different. Christians also believe it's a sin to sacrifice to other gods, but unlike Jews, they enthusiastically seek converts and spread their religion. More and more Romans are refusing to take part in traditional sacrifices. Since these sacrifices are supposed to guarantee the success of the Roman state, traditionalists like Diocletian blame the spread of Christianity for the chaos plaguing Rome for the past century. Fewer Romans making sacrifices means that the gods have turned their backs on Rome. So in the early 300s, Diocletian launches initiatives targeting all religious minorities who refuse to sacrifice. Churches are burned, their wealth confiscated for the state. In 304, Diocletian orders all subjects to prove their loyalty by making sacrifices. Anyone refusing to make such sacrifice is considered a traitor to the Roman state and is executed. This is called the Great Persecution. There have been Christian persecutions in Rome before, but this is the largest and most systematic yet, because Diocletian is more organized and in control of the entire empire than any earlier ruler. Ironically, this time of trial only serves to strengthen Christianity in the long run. Christian communities stick closer together against the Roman state, and the persecution cements the ideology of resistance and martyrdom within Christianity that persists to this day. Look up any history of the Christian Church, and you'll find much admiration for the early saints martyred at the hands of the Roman government. As I've mentioned, persecution of Christians has been going on inconsistently since the reign of Nero. Most emperors leave Christians alone, but there are occasional periods of hostility. Diocletian's reign is the worst persecution yet, and the era in which the tradition of Christian martyrdom begins in earnest. Diocletian's health begins to fail in 305, and he decides to retire to his hometown of Split. This makes Diocletian another big first, the first emperor who retires and gives up his power willingly to a successor rather than dying on the throne. He believes that to guarantee stability, both Augusti must retire at the same time so that both Caesars can take power, Galerius in the east and Constantius in the west. So he makes Maximian retire with him. Diocletian and Galerius, the eastern Augustus and Caesar, decide on both the new Caesars. They choose Maximin Daia for the east and Severus for the west. Maximian and Constantius, the two western emperors, get no say in their own successors. They've left out a number of powerful men who think they deserve a seat. In the east is Licinius, who served under Galerius. In the west is Constantius's son, Constantine, whom Constantius would certainly have chosen for his Caesar if he was given a choice, and Maxentius, the son of Maximian. And of course there's Maximian himself, who never wanted to retire and will be looking for power. I know, we've got 3 Maxes right now. All these emperors and hopeful emperors are confusing enough without adding a bunch of similar-sounding names. Diocletian's desire for an orderly succession gets hopelessly chaotic immediately. Everyone resents the fact that Diocletian and Galerius elevated all their own choices with no concern for the wishes of the others, and there is intense rivalry. Diocletian's fame is that he's the one who split the empire into east and west, but in fact it's more complicated than that. His system was more about having multiple rulers available to lead armies than about assigning any given territory to them. But he was certainly an extreme reformer who left a huge mark on the government. Nothing is ever the same after him. He is extremely successful himself, but his carefully constructed system collapses as soon as his strong personality is removed from it, a story we've heard before in Roman history. Okay, a few questions for review. First, why did Diocletian consider Christianity a threat? It was because Christians refused to make sacrifices to the traditional gods. It was never about what his subjects believed, only about what they would or wouldn't do. Next, how were the new Caesars chosen at the end of the first Tetrarchy? The Eastern emperors chose both new Caesars, leaving the Western emperors out entirely. So we rejoin the second Tetrarchy after the abdication. Galerius and Constantius are the Augusti, Maximin Daia and Severus II are the Caesars, and a lot of people are mad about it. In 305, the aging Constantius is fighting the Picts in Scotland, and his son Constantine joins him there. Constantine, who is one of the ones who thinks he should have been made Caesar. Constantius is ill. He is sickly enough that he is sometimes called Constantius Chlorus, or Constantius the Pale. He dies in 306. By the system Diocletian set up, now Severus should automatically become Augustus, and all the remaining tetrarchs should decide on a Caesar to place under him. But the troops ignore this and declare Constantine Augustus. Galerius is furious, but also far away, so he compromises and said that Constantine can be Caesar to Severus's Augustus. Later in 306, the Praetorian Guard and the people of Rome declare Maxentius, son of Maximian, Augustus. He and Maximian hole up together in Rome. Severus attacks him, but his army defects to the other side because they used to be Maximian's army. Galerius sends some of his own armies, but they defect too. In 308, Galerius calls a conference of tetrarchs and invites Diocletian too. They urge Diocletian to take the throne again, and he refuses because he prefers tending his garden to ruling an empire. He says, "If you could only see the cabbages we've planted with our own hands." But he helps them hammer out a deal. They'll make Galerius's friend Licinius Augustus in the west, and his job will be to eliminate Maximian and Maxentius. Is this starting to look like the crisis of the 3rd century? Meanwhile, Maximian double-crosses his own son to try to seize power, fails, and flees to Constantine's camp. He tries the same thing there, and Constantine has him killed. Maximin Daia, Galerius's Caesar in the east, is resentful that Licinius has been made Augustus without ever being Caesar, so he has his troops declare him Augustus. So now we have 5 emperors, all calling themselves Augustus with varying levels of legitimacy, and all feuding. Constantine in the north, Maxentius in Italy, Licinius in Eastern Europe, Galerius in Greece and Asia Minor, and Maximin Daia in the east. Constantine and Maxentius both call a halt to the persecution of Christians in the west. Constantine in this era seems to adhere to Sol Invictus like most of the army does, but he is tolerant of religious minorities. Galerius and Daia are still persecuting with vigor in the east, until 311, when Galerius decides that the persecutions are only furthering discord. He issues the Edict of Toleration, which gives Christians and other minorities the right to meet, shortly before his death in 311. But Daia and Licinius pick the persecution right back up. As soon as Galerius is dead, Daia and Licinius start to fight for supremacy in the east. Licinius never much cared about the west he was assigned to. This leaves Constantine free to go rid himself of Maxentius. In 312, Maxentius leads his army outside the city walls of Rome to meet Constantine's forces, which is a bad move, leaving the fortified walls behind. When Constantine's army forces Maxentius into retreat, they run across the Milvian Bridge and into a booby trap that they themselves had set. The bridge collapses and Maxentius dies. Constantine takes Rome and becomes sole Augustus in the west. Now, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 is famous because it is said to have been the moment of Constantine's conversion to Christianity, which might be the single most consequential religious event in European history. The story goes that Constantine has a vision, either just before the battle or in the days leading up to it, of the Chi-Rho, which is a symbol for Christianity, more common than the cross during this era. It's the first 2 letters of Christ in Greek. The vision tells him, "In hoc signo vinces," or "in this sign you will conquer." So Constantine has his soldiers paint the Chi-Rho on their shields, and when he wins the battle, he sees it as evidence of the power of the Christian God. This story is, of course, shrouded in legend. And Constantine's conversion is not instantaneous. He grows closer to Christianity in private throughout the rest of his life. In public, he plays coy about what god or gods he's following at first. There's no Christian imagery on the triumphal arch of Constantine he later builds, or on his coinage. He continues to give public favor to Sol Invictus. Historians aren't exactly sure what Constantine believed at this time of his life. Maybe he isn't quite sure yet and is hedging his bets with other gods, or maybe he's sincerely Christian and hiding it from the Roman people. Most of Rome's population is still hostile to Christianity. Constantine can get away with using the Christian god for military success, but it will be a number of years before he can openly promote Christianity at home. But Constantine allying with religious minorities gives him an excuse to go after his rival. Maximin Daia is an avid persecutor, and Constantine asks him to stop. When he refuses, Constantine allies with Licinius to oppose him. They issue the Edict of Milan in 313, which establishes official religious freedom and restores confiscated property to churches. Daia marches into Licinius's territories, but Licinius defeats him, and Daia dies in hiding. Now there are 2 emperors, and they divide the empire between them, Constantine in the west and Licinius in the east. Their joint rule lasts 11 years, until 324, but they do a lot of fighting, some of it even in battle. Both set up their sons as Caesars, reverting to dynasty building rather than the cooperative rule of the Tetrarchy. Around 320, as Constantine is becoming more open about his own devotion to Christianity, Licinius resumes persecution against Christians in the East. Constantine sets himself up as defender of all believers and marches against Licinius. Constantine wins in 324 and is now the sole ruler of Rome. After 40 years of attempted shared rule, Rome has one emperor again. Constantine modernizes the Roman army into its final successful form. Like his predecessors, he keeps a light force of permanent troops on the border, and he sets up a new system for the much larger mobile forces who will respond to crises. But decades of depopulation in Roman territory causes the huge army to turn increasingly to foreign recruits. For the first time, many of the officers who rise to the highest levels of military power are non-citizens. A new elite of foreign generals develops and becomes highly influential. From here on out, the emperor's closest military advisor will almost always be a non-Roman. Constantine wants to create a divided rule that will still involve family inheritance, which he believes is stronger than the more bureaucratic style of Diocletian. So he gives the title of Caesar to all 4 of his sons. If you thought the Maxes were bad, get ready for Constantine II, Constantius II, Constans, and Crispus. Gotta have an outlier. Constantine begins to involve himself directly in disputes within the Christian Church, calling councils under his own authority to address arguments about religious dogma. The biggest is the Council of Nicea in 325, which he calls to address the teachings of Arius. Arius argues that Christ was created by God and is thus of a lower order than God. The Council of Nicea rules against him, stating that the Father and the Son are one and the same. This eventually turns into the theology of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are 3 but also 1. The Council of Nicea also creates the Nicene Creed, an organized statement of belief that is still recited in many Christian churches today. These sorts of high-stakes decisions are a bit new to Christianity. It's been a loosely structured minority for a long time, with much variation between local churches. But now that Christianity has a spotlight on it, Christians start to iron out all these differences to create orthodoxy. Constantine also gives special privileges and powers to bishops. Church leadership becomes both a part of Roman government and an important counterweight to it, since churches remain mostly independent. Constantine is involved in the decision to make Sunday the Sabbath day or day of rest for Christianity. The Jewish Sabbath has always been Saturday. He builds new churches, including magnificent ones in Rome, one of which is still the Pope's headquarters today, and ones in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. In the aftermath of the Jewish revolts of the 1st and 2nd centuries, in which Hadrian expelled the Jews from their homeland, Judea had become an ignored and depopulated backwater. Constantine turns it into a site for pilgrimages of the faithful, which it still is to this day. Constantine starts pulling down pagan temples in 324, and may have even outlawed sacrifices, though if he did, it didn't stick. But his efforts at ending paganism are inconsistent and half-hearted. He makes no effort to put an end to the cult worship of deified former emperors, for example, probably because the current emperor benefits so much from religious worship of his predecessors. Constantine does confiscate large amounts of wealth from pagan temples. He displays them in secular settings or has them melted down for coins. Almost accidentally from this injection of wealth, Constantine moves Rome from a silver standard to a gold standard. This finally decreases inflation and improves faith in the monetary system, but also widens the gap between rich and poor. Constantine is known for one hugely significant act other than his conversion to Christianity: the creation of Rome's second capital, Constantinople. He establishes it in 330 CE on the former site of Byzantium, a Greek city in modern-day Turkey. It's perfectly situated as a capital for the eastern half of the empire. The East has always been quite distinct from the West, and ever since the crisis of the 3rd century and Diocletian, the Roman state has moved toward treating it as a separate entity. Constantine builds his city in grand style, aiming to create a second Rome with all the same amenities as the original. It even has its own second Senate. Constantine reverses the trend of de-emphasizing the Senate that began all the way back with Septimius Severus. He increases the power and role of the Senate, both in Rome and in Constantinople. He uses membership in the Senate as a reward for reaching the highest levels of the imperial bureaucracy. Since these new senators are people who rise to the top through Constantine's administration, the senates in both Rome and Constantinople become overwhelmingly composed of Christians. Constantine dies in 337. He spent 31 years on the throne, the second longest reign in Roman history, second only to Augustus's 41-year reign. Constantine is baptized as Christian on his deathbed. Baptism is a formal initiation into the Christian faith, and it strikes modern believers as odd that Constantine would wait until near his death to be baptized. Most modern Christians are baptized either as infants or as young adults. But deathbed baptism was a common practice in Christianity at this time, and it was especially useful for an emperor who needed to wage wars and order executions, which are sins. Baptism washes away sins for a clean slate. There's also a story that Constantine wanted to be baptized in the Jordan River, where Jesus himself was baptized, and so wanted to conquer its region before his baptism. This may or may not be true. But, adding to the religious confusion that marks Constantine's reign, Constantine is deified after his death and added to the emperors who are worshipped by the pagan imperial cults. A few questions for review before we wrap up Constantine. First, where did Constantine defeat Maxentius and claim aid from the Christian god? If you said the Milvian Bridge, you're right. The Sublician Bridge is another famous bridge into Rome, the early one that Horatius Cocles defended. Milan is a northern Italian city, whose significance we'll get to in a moment, and Ravenna is a city near Rome. It's easier to defend than Rome because it's on a swamp, and it's starting to become an important refuge for emperors in this era. Next, what is the Edict of Milan? The Edict of Milan is the famous joint declaration of Constantine and Licinius granting legal status to Christianity in 313. It only guaranteed Christians' right to practice. It did not make Christianity the state religion, which didn't happen until 380, decades after Constantine's death. At his death, Constantine leaves Rome in its most prosperous state in many years. But there are already signs of trouble. The Goths and Sasanians are making trouble in the north and east again, and these conflicts will devour the next 50 years. And, like Diocletian, Constantine's plans for his succession will fall apart almost immediately and plunge Rome back into civil war. Still, Constantine's Christianity and construction of the eastern capital Constantinople will open up a new era in the history of Europe and the world. I say European history instead of Roman history because the history of Rome as we know it is coming to an end. Constantine is the last emperor to rule an undivided Rome, and the last truly stable and successful Roman emperor in the West. Next week, the moment we knew must come, the fall of Rome.
Constantinople been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople